He is the one who fully represents God, but he is the one who fully represents what it means to be a human being. And if we see Christ as the God in the flesh is important as just as much as important as the God part.
Right.
Because Christ is the pattern for what God intends for us. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a human being? Well, as far as you and I are concerned, we're not there yet.
Right.
But boy, that gets us to really an important kind of matter, and it is this really troubling, problematic issue of abortion, and the questions that are dodged in the whole abortion issue, and that is, what is the status of the unborn child? We've seen the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade, or I should say we've seen the recent return of the issue to the states. Mm-hmm. But one of the issues in the original decision of Roe v. Wade was their deliberate refusal to address the question of the status of the unborn child, or the fetus, as they would call it.
Right.
And they say, they say explicitly, philosophers disagree on this, theologians disagree, biologists, geneticists, scientists, physicians, we don't know. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to make the decision on these terms. We're going to leave it in the hands of the individual and the physician. Okay, that's where Roe v. Wade left it. The problem with that is behind the confusion about the status of the unborn child is an absolute confusion of the status of any of us, of what it means to be a human being for unborn or born. Mm-hmm. And it is entirely up for grabs. There is no consensus in our culture other than that there is no consensus. And then where that's left us is each and every individual gets to choose for him, her, or they self how they want to identify themselves.
Sure.
There are no boundaries. There's nothing given with creation that identifies what it means to be a human being. And so it is entirely up for grabs.
Well, I think when you remove the foundation of the Scripture, you know, when you have a Supreme Court justice now who cannot, in a question, cannot even answer what is a woman.
Right.
We're not talking about, you know, a first grade child. We're talking about someone that's going to be sitting on the Supreme Court who cannot even give an answer to that basic question.
But the justice simply is reflecting the
culture and
the
pressure,
the lack of consensus in our culture at large. It's an honest representation of a confused culture. If Jesus is the one who defines and represents truly what it means to be a human being, mm-hmm. then here's the way one Christian bioethicist put it. His name is Paul Ramsey. Said, "You, me, all of us, we are all fellow fetuses." Mm. And to draw hard and fast distinctions between the unborn and then the born is to say, well, at least we know we're human. We're not so sure about the unborn.
Yeah.
Well, if Christ is the measure, then we are all fellow fetuses. Mm-hmm. And to ask, is the unborn child a human being or not? To me, that is just absolutely, it is language gone on a holiday. Yeah. It is just the language of nonsense. If it's the way I raise it in my course on bioethics. If we look at that unborn child and we ask, well, is that a human being? Is that, or the way the language of Roe versus Wade puts it, is that a human life? It's almost aggravating to hear that question raised. Mm-hmm. If it's not a human, we have to ask, well, where did the zebra fetus come from? How did that get in there? Or the buffalo fetus, or the pig embryo? Or where? If it's not a human, then this is all a greater mystery,
Yes.
And if it's not alive, then the issue is rendered moot because we're dealing with a miscarriage. If it is alive and if it is human, where do we then go? Well, but is it a human life? To me, that is just language that's gone on a holiday. It just means we're not being serious about how we're talking here.
Right.
But if we also want to remember that Christ is the measure of what it means to be a human being, that how can I dare treat the unborn in any way other than the way I would treat you or any other fellow fetus?
Yeah, I like that.
Because we're not there yet. None of us are. And, people want to dodge the issue of human life. So, well, but is it a person? I have to ask the question of myself. If Christ is, again, if he's the full measure, I'm just on my way, and I'm not yet fully the person God intends for me to be. But that doesn't mean I don't need to treat other fellow fetuses with the same respect, the same sense of dignity, same safeguards, protections that I would any other fellow traveler. So but we have to admit this though as well on the abortion issue. The argument has gotten to the point where the insistence is the status of the unborn is irrelevant. There are those who argue that say that really doesn't matter. Fully human, fully person, whatever, it is still, that is immaterial.
Yeah.
It is still the ultimate right of the individual to treat the reliant unborn child as however I propose.
It's almost become a convenience factor.
Well, it certainly is.
It's
Now,
very
I don't
sad.
want to
That's just part of it. That's
it's part of it.
oversimplifying
It's not the whole story, and
No.
we're not grappling sufficiently, I don't think, with the hard cases of genuine threats to the life of the mother. I think we have to take those seriously.
Serious.
And there are a whole host of complications that can come up, but let's get back to this basic reminder that if we're asking what does it mean to be a human being, which underlies all sorts of other bioethical issues as well, whether it's genetic engineering of our children, matters of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. What does it mean to be a human being enters in at every level here. If we can orient ourselves towards we're God's good creation, so valuable that God would immerse himself in the brokenness of creation to redeem us, that we might become what God created us to be.
Yes.
If we can begin with that, and if we can keep before us the last Adam, the eschaton Adam, the Adam to which we will ultimately be conformed, then we have some reference points for, I think, addressing a whole host of these really complicated bioethical issues.
Yeah. Well, I think in the beginning, when God created Adam and Eve, there was, at that point in time, there was no gospel to preach. There were no sermons to deliver. There was no missionaries to send to the foreign field or anything. It was just Adam and Eve hanging out with God.
Exactly.
In the cool of the day.
Exactly. Bonhoeffer says something really important. I don't know if you remember, because you've read through about a third of my book, you might remember this little bit where I invoke Bonhoeffer and his account of what happens in the garden. We have all these complicated issues of abortion or genetic engineering or of physician-assisted suicide, and so on and so forth. And we grapple with, well, what's the right thing to do? What's right versus what's wrong? Bonhoeffer says, you know what? That's what got us into trouble to begin with. Our quest to define those terms on our own, the knowledge of good and evil, that we can make those kinds of decisions. Mm-hmm. What does that represent? It simply reflects our disunion with God. You're exactly right. Yeah. Before Genesis 3, all there is Adam and Eve in fellowship with God. And it's only consequent to the fall that we now grapple with all these complications, and that we now come up with systems of ethics, for example, to help us make decisions about the difference between good and evil. Bonhoeffer's point is, you know, that entire enterprise simply reflects the fall of humanity. And if we can remember that what God is all about is drawing us back into that fellowship, then these other matters, this gets back to my concern with moralism.
Yes.
If we can get back to this basic concern of God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, overcoming this disunion, then so many of these other matters are seen in a completely different light. But if we want to talk about good and evil without reference to the God who holds out all the blessings, the gifts, the goodness of life in the garden, if we want to do that without reference to all that, then that's where we repeat the errors proposed to us by the serpent at the very beginning there. And that's not where we want to be.
Yeah, I think it's like toward the end of Judges, it says, kind of where we're at now, every man does what's right in his own eyes.
Right.
And, you know, if I want to do this, I'm going to do it. If Jeph wants to do this, you go do that. And we've made ourselves in a position, humanly speaking, because of the sin in the garden.
What you're talking about there is
moved on.
The rise of the autonomous self.
Yes.
What does it mean to be a human being? With the advent of the modern era, we're talking about the 17th on into the 18th centuries, we have this
reach your fullest potential.
And as we have the invention of the individual, and the individual who is addressed by Immanuel Kant, dare to use your own reason, the autonomous self, the self-ruled self. And that's
gotten us in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, well, there you go. And I think you're right. It's just simply the echo of the last chapter and verse of Judges. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. Yeah. Kant would say, well, that's exactly what we're looking for. Kant had a much greater confidence in human rationality, that it wouldn't be distorted and corrupted by our lack of trust in God's goodness.
I don't think I share his view.
Yeah, well, and I do have to wonder if Kant were around today, if he would not ask himself, what have I done?
Yeah.
What have I done? If we can keep these poles of creation and new creation, if we can keep those reference points, then we could talk about so many other areas, apart from abortion and bioethical issues, but matters of marriage and family, matters of politics and economics. Undergirding all of these areas and the complicated conversations, and not conversations, but battles that we have these days are all, I think, reflective of this lack of consensus of what it means to be a human being. That these days is entirely up for grabs, and so each one gets to write for him, her, or they self, whatever identity they would propose.
We have to engage the culture with truth, though.
Truth,
you have to speak the truth in love to them.
Exactly, truth and love, and I think that
acknowledge their identity whatever they're trying to identify as. It's not love on my part not to say, wait a minute.
And you say truth and love. I love that reference, Ephesians 4. Also, but it takes us back to the incarnation. The Word was made flesh and dwelled among us, full of grace and truth. So can we keep that together? If Jesus embodies that, grace and truth, Paul's speaking the truth in love, can we embody that sort of witness in the world today to give affirmation of the goodness that God intends for human well-being? Can we model that? Can we live as witnesses to that, knowing that we're but fellow fetuses ourselves, and we're on the way. We are in need of God's grace on the journey, and we need to express that that grace of God to others as well as fellow travelers.
I think what Paul says too, he who began a good work in you.
Yeah.
And we're all just a work in progress. He'll be faithful to complete it. And the gospel is encouraging. It's it's not a list of commandments just to drag us down. Jesus came to give us life more abundantly.
The commandments not to drag us down. The commandments that are themselves testimony to life. In the Old Testament, this is a couple of semesters back, I always kind of begin a class at the beginning of the semester and say, all right, what are people's thoughts on the Old Testament? What do people think about what's going on here? And I remember a couple of years ago, one young man said, well, it's just a bunch of rules. And yeah, they're there, but they are in the context, and I make this point. I asked the question, how do the 10 Commandments begin? And I said, it's a trick question. How do they begin? How do the 10 Commandments begin? And some of them know enough to say, well, you shall have no other gods before me. I go, kinda. That's the first of the commandments, but how they begin is, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. They begin with the reminder of God's gracious intervention. And all that follows is simply,
you're a special, peculiar people unto me.
Right. And this is what life looks like that reflects the God who has intervened on behalf of a bunch of helpless slaves.
Right.
And they either worship that God and all that will follow from that. They will honor mother and father. They won't commit adultery. They won't steal, all that kind of other stuff. Or they will not honor that God, and they will gravitate toward the gods of the Canaanites, which is all about grasping for power and control and domination, and all that other stuff in the 10 Commandments won't make any sense. Right. What we have in these commandments, these are the commandments of life. And so I asked this guy, he said, well, let me just ask, do you want to live in a culture where thou shalt not kill is negotiable?
Right.
What if at the end of the semester you make such and such a grade, and in the syllabus I say, well, that's an A or a B, but at the end of the semester I go, well, I don't like him, so I'm going to give him an F. So what about this? You shall not bear false witness. Do you want to live in a culture where that's tossed aside? Is that what you want? These are not arbitrary whims of a capricious deity. These are the commandments of life. And Jesus knows that, and Jesus affirms that. And the issue is, for Paul, not do we discard all that, but how can we know that? And so Paul will say, what the law could not do, God did through the sending of his Son, that we might walk in ways that reflect the will of God, that we might walk in ways not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And when we walk according to the Spirit, we will fulfill the righteous demands of the law. We will live our lives in keeping with God's good will. What does it mean to be a human being? Well, what does it look like? I think the 10 Commandments are a good reference point for what that looks like. Well, that's the life of society that God intends for us. How do we do that? Is it simply on the basis of the demands of the law? Paul says, no, we're not going to do that. If we try to do that, we're just going to make things worse. We need God's redemptive work. Yes. What the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did through sending his own Son, so that we could walk according to the Spirit. We can't do it apart from this, the newness of life that God offers.
Like Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it.
Yeah, right.
So,
if we want that fulfillment in our own lives, it is as the Spirit of God enables such a life where we reflect God's will in the world. And then how do we specify that in things like economics or politics or marriage and family or bioethical issues? Those are all important areas for conversation. But we have to have some basic reference points to guide that discussion.